Welcome to the second episode of The Car Show. I'm Doug Stewart.
I'm Glenn Packman.
I am the senior digital content producer at Fox 61. And we got a lot of good feedback on our first episode, and we're happy you're watching. So the first things that we wanted to talk about, Glenn, are recalls.
Yes.
There have been a lot of big number recalls that I've seen recently.
There suddenly seems to be like a flood of them on the market. And the first thing that my mind goes to is the pandemic to blame somehow for this.
Interesting.
Because we're seeing a shortage of workers across the board, a lot of technically advanced people just not being available for jobs. And I'm wondering if this is just filtering down into the quality segment of the auto industry.
I think, yeah, I mean, when you look at the first one, the Ford F-150 has almost 500,000 of their 2021 and 22 F-150 pickups because the windshield wipers may stop working. And it seems to be like something along the assembly line.
Yeah, if I can be completely honest, here's what frightens me about Ford and having that kind of recall is I go all the way back to the 70s with the Pinto, which was more than just a recall issue. That was really bad design issue and a bad design choice, And with a big company like Ford, I automatically just go to that place of like, okay, so is this just something faulty on the assembly line, or is this just really bad design in motion?
Yeah.
Makes me nervous. I don't have an answer for it, unfortunately, because it really comes down to technical stuff that's way beyond me. But I still, as a consumer, I wonder.
And you could say the same thing about the GM ignition recall in 10 or so years ago, where those cars, the steering columns would lock up, and and I think it's probably a mix. I think it's probably a mix of like, some of these things, they realized it once they were manufacturing it. And some of them are like, well, that we shouldn't have done,
Sure.
You also have like the Dodge Ram pickup trucks have their tailgate will open, and the car,
right.
That's going to be bad,
Yeah. Although, what's a little junk spilling out onto the freeway among friends? I mean, it's just
tree stumps. Yeah.
It's not like that hasn't happened to me with a mattress in the back of my former pickup truck, for example.
all those people on that night in 1997 on I-95.
Wasn't me.
Recalls happen for newer manufacturers as well. You have Rivian having to recall almost all the vehicles that they built. 13,000 vehicles because of a fastener connecting the vehicle's upper front control arm and steering knuckle may not be torqued enough. And it's a 30-second fix, right?
Right.
But it's not like Joe Rivian owner can hustle on down to, Rivians Are Us, and they got to bring, the service to them. So
true.
And
that being said, when you're buying something from such a new manufacturer, the universal you needs to be aware of the fact that you're taking on that this is a new company and they're spreading their wings and they're learning how to build a car. No matter how many experts they bring on board and how much work they've done, 9 times out of 10 new car manufacturers have these hiccups. So it just stuff like that is dangerous. That's the only thing that just is scary. But you have well-established car companies that have had dangerous products too. I think back to the whole Firestone tire debacle. They should have known better about that. Firestone's been around for generations. So
I think part of it too is I remember talking to an astronaut once, and they were talking about how there had been a series of delays in the launch of a specific, and they viewed it as, they looked at it as a good thing, they said, if the launch is delayed, they found a problem, and we want them to fix that problem. And so that sort of like made me think about recalls, in that they found a problem, we want to fix it. Everything's different, but I think that there's an inconvenience factor. You're going to have to park your Subaru Ascent outside because they're afraid that something's going to catch fire. We saw that with Chevy's EVs.
Yeah. Well, and there is something to be said for problematic issues that never get recalled. I don't know if you recall my RAV4 from a few years ago. It came from the factory with what became known among RAV4 owners as the squeak, which was, there was a problem with the windshield where the windshield would rub against the A-pillars of the car and make a sound exactly like the sound of a styrofoam cooler top being rubbed against the rest of the cooler. And it was incessant. And I mean, now I'm a lot OCD, but this was like, I had passengers in my car who were like, I can never drive with you ever again. It's driving me out of my mind. Yeah. And then I finally found the fix on the internet. And I actually went to Toyota of Stamford and I said, hey, there's this. And I printed everything out. Yeah, and the guy there was like, oh crap. He said, can we use your car as, an alpha test, and we'll go from there. Didn't charge me a penny. The fix wasn't pretty. They put in a bunch of new screws that didn't look finished, but it stopped the squeak, and he was, this guy was forever in my, thankful to me for bringing this to him, because he had literally hundreds of RAV owners calling him on the phone going, I'm losing my mind, over the squeaking windshield. And that wasn't even a recall. And P.S., it's from a manufacturer that, prides themselves on high quality,
Well, we'll wrap up here with my favorite recall of the year.
Okay.
The Bugatti Chiron Pure Sports. All of the production, 60 of them, of these $4 million cars were recalled this year. Because the rear tires had problems, and they could do things like, bad things.
Yeah.
So, although all our viewers who are Bugatti Chiron owners, hope you got your car recalled. Hope you have another car that you can use while you're getting the Chiron fixed. On to segment 2. We're going to talk about the future of the Chrysler Corporation, or what used to be Chrysler Corporation in the U.S. So, Glenn, if you will permit me, we're going to go in the Wayback Machine. I don't know which one of us is Sherman and which one's Peabody, but well. So 30 years ago, model year 1993, Chrysler sold the LeBaron Coupe and a smaller sedan, the Concorde, the New Yorker / Fifth Avenue, which were two sort of distinct models, and the Town and Country. You go down the hall to Dodge, and they had the Caravan, the Colt, the Daytona, the Dynasty, the Intrepid, the Shadow, the Spirit, the Stealth, and the Viper. At that time, Ram was part of Dodge, and they had 2 flavors of pickup trucks, larger and a smaller, and a van, cargo 15-passenger van. Jeep had the Cherokee, the Grand Cherokee, and the Wrangler. Plymouth had the Acclaim, the Laser, the Sundance, and the Voyager. Eagle division sold the Vision, the Talon, and the Summit. I remember 1993 as being like, they're about to launch into something big. The LH platform was launching that year, and it was followed by the Stratus and the Cirrus, the redesigned Dodge Ram, which killed it out of the box, and the 3rd generation of popular minivans. Let's go to today. Chrysler sells 2 models, the 300 and the Pacific. Dodge sells 3, the Charger, the Challenger, and the Durango. Ram has variations of their pickup in different weight classes and 2 commercial vans. Plymouth doesn't exist, Eagle doesn't exist, and what we have left is Jeep, and they have what could be considered the widest range of models, right? They have everything from the Renegade to the Grand Wagoneer, 7 distinct body styles, 2 of which have hybrid versions. Where do you think the company goes from here?
Super good question. And the Chrysler Corporation has always been the one that seems to push themselves right to the edge of being completely relevant, and then they come out with a product that brings them back into the fold. They had the minivan in the early 80s. They had the 300. Really, they were close to being dead on the water, and then they introduced that first beautifully boxy 300 that everyone wanted, and they just seem to be hitting it right. And I think they're at another one of those points. I think the big difference that you're bringing up is the market from 1993 to today, 29 years ago, was completely different in regards to what people really wanted to drive.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the number of four-door sedans on the road. That was the car back then.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Americans wanted. And now, almost 30 years later, we're really in the throes of the SUV craze. And I think Dodge is just, Dodge, Chrysler, et cetera, is just slow on the uptake on that. And that's why I think you see Jeep being their big division right now, because that's the product that people are looking for. Nameplates like Dodge and Chrysler might go the way of Oldsmobile and Plymouth, just not really relevant anymore and not finding a niche anywhere in the world. It's worth pointing out that GM, for example, has the Buick nameplate that they're keeping alive because that brand is huge in China and huge in the Chinese market. The Chinese, for some reason, love the Buick nameplate. And the only reason that GM is keeping it alive, really, is because they're selling so many Buicks over there. I don't think Chrysler really has that market share in China or any of the other countries that, on the world where there's a big car market. I don't think they have that niche. So they're really playing to the United States more than everybody else. And what does the United States want to buy? Perhaps if they take Dodge and make that their sporting division, because they've got a good,
which it kind of is.
Yeah. Their muscle car division. They've got the Challenger is a beautiful redesign. The Charger, I think they still sell a fair amount of, and not a bad car.
No, and actually sold more Challengers than Mustangs or Camaros.
Really, yeah. And I think that all comes down to a really cool body style that is a nod
and a honking big engine.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that end, I know that Dodge is planning on taking the new is it the Tonale from Alfa Romeo?
Mm-hmm.
They're smaller. They're RAV4 Honda CR-V sized SUV, and they're planning on making that a captive within the Dodge lineup and calling it the Hornet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a terrible idea, because if it's within that sporting vein that Dodge seems to be positioning itself towards, that might be, within what they're trying to do with the brand. I think the thing they need to shake is that my parents loved their Dodges, and they certainly weren't buying them to be sporty. They were buying them to haul a lot of people and have fake wood siding along the sides. So, and yeah, exactly. And the same thing with Chrysler. They've got the 300 and the Pacifica, both good cars. The Pacifica is about as good as a minivan gets. But what are they doing with the division, the line, what's the appeal? What's the niche that they're going to be carving out? I
think they just missed the boat with, they didn't have any SUVs, and you see Ford and GM transition. They had a decent lineup of SUVs, and they easily kind of transitioned into that. And there's a lot of people who miss the sedan, the Fusion, the Taurus, and stuff like that. But Ford seems to just, GM to the same similar degree. We're moving on. That's where the market is. That's where we're going to go. And and there should have been a somebody in Chrysler saying, we've got to push out some SUVs. And it's should have somebody in there saying, we got to get some EVs online here. So you do have, so in the larger picture, Stellantis, which has 16 different brands, some of which most Americans have never heard of. But there's, and I'm going to throw up a picture of it. I don't know if you've seen it. There's an electric version Opel is proposing of the Manta, which I've always thought was one of the, going back to the 60s, was one of the nicest looking cars. And that has something. They came out with a Charger EV, I think, that they came out a couple months ago. You have Jeep moving in that direction. Cherokee and Wrangler both have EV versions. Right? So I think you have some pieces, and the head of Stellantis has talked glowingly of Chrysler, especially in the U.S. Not so much about Fiat, and I think that's part of it too. Is like, the company put a whole bunch of resources in selling Fiats, and it never went anywhere. The same thing with Alphas. It's there, but it's not certainly first of mind when somebody is looking at vehicles. I think there's probably, if they take a good look at it, you could probably bring some Opels over. Buick literally did it with the Regal, right?
Yep, the Regal was an Opel. My point of all of this is that I think Chrysler, Dodge, etc., focus on just really a better product overall. They do a good car, they do a great one. I don't know what they need to take that extra step. I think about the Grand Cherokee, which really is a nice looking car, but I've never been fond of the interior. There's something very blocky and tall and not airy about the interior, and just it's never struck me as looking worth the money. It's one of those, it's those little things that just aren't hitting with the US market now. It just seems like somebody's doing better. So what they need to do at Chrysler is they need to find out what can we do to be better, and also they just need to come up with that next relevant car like they have done in the past. So but overall, the quality of our two Chryslers was both very good, not superb, but good. I would drive either of those cars again easily. Ironically, they both got handed down to the same stepson, who's like our Chrysler kid. So he still has the 200, drives it daily. So it's a nice looking car.
That is a nice looking car. To go back to your Cherokee thoughts, I had a Cherokee for work. I loved that car. It was 99, I think. It was a second generation. It was a good looking car. And side note, there's not a Jeep badge on the Wagoneer. Doesn't say Jeep anyway.
Really?
I don't know. But
interesting.
I think this airflow concept looks really cool, but you got to get it to the market. You got to get it out there. You got to sell it. I mean, we're rapidly approaching the point where you're not going to be able to sell an internal combustion engine car in California. And I don't know the exact percentage, but California buys a lot of cars, and so that has to, you have to get it done, and the fifth, Stellantis is the fifth largest car manufacturer in the world, and they have plants all over. They need to start building. But I think you mentioned this. Chrysler ping pongs from wow to oh my God, we're almost out of business. Wow.
Right. More so than any other automaker that I can think of.
Any.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know.
They're a conundrum.
A conundrum. for our next segment, they recently came out this past week, came out with a new IA Insurance Institute of Highway Safety. Crash some more cars, which they are, that's what they do. And they tested like what is the sweet spot in the market right now, the small SUVs. And they did a big range of them. And what they found was that only 2 of them, they upgraded their crash test. And what it is it's called the moderate front offset, and they hit a barrier at 40 miles an hour. And the thing that makes this crash different from just the regular slam is that the barrier is offset, so it hits only 40% of the total width of the car. So if you take the center line, it's off to one side of the center line. Like if it hits a concrete barrier or glances into a telephone pole or anything like that. It's a fairly common crash. And what has happened over the past 10 years or so is that they have upgraded this crash, and made it harder and harder. And what's happened now, for background, is that the front passenger and driver have an excellent chance of getting through the crash, fewer injuries, fewer serious injuries, and fewer fatalities. What they're looking at now is the rear seat passengers.
Right.
So we have only 2 small SUVs that earned a good rating: Ford Escape and the Volvo XC40. And then it goes off from there. It's like Toyota RAV4 acceptable, Audi Q3, Nissan Rogue, Super Forester ratings marginal, and then 9 of them: Buick Encore, Chevy Equinox, Honda CR-V, Honda HR-V, Hyundai Tucson, Jeep Compass, Jeep Renegade, Mazda CX-5, and the Mitsubishi Eclipse Cross are all rated 4.
Well, I think it's really worth noting that, they have a lot of ratings of cars as being poor here, where all of them do very well with the front passengers. So if you're somebody like me who uses the back seat maybe once a year, there's something we're saying there. That being said, that doesn't mean you can't get into a crash that one time out of the year, so you really want to make sure your backseat passengers are protected. And that's where all of these cars fall down, is in the rear seat protection. So it's obviously a field that needs to be worked on. The one car that is good all the way across the board, front and back, sterling reputation, is the Volvo XC40. And the moral of that story is, if you're paranoid about being in a crash and you want to survive, buy a Volvo. They're tanks, they've always been a safe car. And here's just more proof that the Volvo is still the safest car on the road. And Geely has done a superb job at letting Volvo stand alone. I think they are manufacturing some of them in China for the Chinese market, but they got so smart where that was concerned. And now here we are a couple of years later, Volvo still has a great market share. They've got terrific product. And here they are still on top of the crash testing, and good for them.
I think you and I both remember the ads, where they dropped it off a building or something, or they had a bunch of them stacked up on each other. One of the caveats about this study was that some of these are their model year 2021 to 23. It's all 3 model years. So like the Tucson is the last generation Tucson,
right?
So but some of the Fords in the 22 model year had if they're built after May, they get the good rating because they've changed the pretensioners and the. So if you're stopping quickly, the seatbelts lock up and pull back, and that's because you're not with a car with a front passenger, you have the airbags right in front of you, but with the rear passengers, you only have the ones to the side, and that's a difference. So it's design of the rear seat, it's pretensioners. It's part of the problem is that people in some of the cars submarined, like they literally went out
Yep.
on the seatbelt, and hitting the window and the seat pillar. So
Right.
it's interesting.
That's indicative. That's indicative of the offset testing, is that test creates a whole ton of sideways trajectory, whereas the head-ons don't, you know. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the problems with the back seat fails, is that sideways movement causes people to go out from underneath their seat belts, get down sideways. There was one brand where somebody's head could go into the window, through it, and out.
I'll close with one last thing. You know, you hear sometimes, and I'm sure you've probably heard this too. Oh, there's cars in the old days that are better because they have metal all around you and stuff. And have you ever seen the video where I think it was IIHS crashed a 1959 Chevy Bel Air into a 2010 Malibu?
Yes, I have seen that. It's incredible, actually. Yeah.
So, but we all were in those vehicles, somehow we survived.
Sure.
All right, Glenn, we have reached the end of another episode.
Yay.
Yay. If you're watching us on YouTube and you leave the comments down below, we're happy to hear your feedback. Closing words?
Thank you to everyone who's watched. The feedback has been great, and it's nice to know that we're as interesting as we think we are. I hope.
All right. Good night, everyone.